I think it would be fair to say that mainstream media and journalism in particular is in a moment of crisis.
The media no longer even have complete control over what stories they cover in the end because they are subject to huge amounts of influence and pressure.
I don't think people in the industry could have imagined how accelerated this transition would actually be.
Startups tend to come with a model that is sort of mixed economy between subscription, events, partnered content. The costs of entry into our industry are now virtually zero. Someone with a good idea can upend the industry or can create a hit podcast probably in 2 or 3 years. It encourages a market that's led by ideas, by quality and by innovation and by character, and anyone can get into the industry and succeed. That's probably a good thing.
All right, welcome to episode 3 of Global Power Shifts, where we explore a changing world, much of this driven by technology, globalization, and changing demographics. And we also talk to the people at the forefront of this transformation. Today, we'll be chatting to Jamie Angus. He's a seasoned media executive right in the thick of this rapidly changing media landscape. He was among BBC's most senior newsroom leaders for many years and then moved to the Gulf, where he served as the COO of Al Arabiya for 2 years. Thanks for being with us, Jamie.
No, thank you for having me.
Give me a sense of your career to date and what ultimately took you to the Gulf.
Well, I've been a BBC lifer, as we say, so I was actually in the BBC for 23 years. Man and boy, as the English phrase goes. And I started off as a researcher. I used to work in politics when I first left university, and I went to the BBC as a lowly daily news show researcher, and I worked my way up, and eventually I ran some of the BBC's most significant daily news programmes, including the Today programme and Newsnight for a period. And then I finished my career as the World Service Director, so I was running all the BBC's international news services, both in English and in multiple other languages, because, of course, the BBC does digital and broadcasting in 42 other languages, including, of course, Arabic here in this region, BBC Arabic. That was a really good role to finish my career on. And then I moved out here in mid-2022 to do the COO role for Al Arabiya, which I've really enjoyed, just finished up that contract now. And just been fascinating to immerse myself in a completely different market, different culture, and an organisation with very different challenges. Al Arabiya has been moving from Dubai, where it's historically been based, all the way to Riyadh, along with NBC, their sister organisation. So actually doing a lot of work in and out of Saudi Arabia as well, which has been a super interesting period and really learning a lot about both of these two markets.
And what's been the biggest difference coming from the UK to living and working in the Gulf? You've had an international career, but it's always a little bit different when you're on the ground.
Yeah, I think the big difference professionally has been coming out of a public broadcasting environment and then going to work into a private media organisation, which obviously, NBC is now a public organisation, but Al Arabiya is a privately owned company. And obviously, public media, and particularly the BBC, has its very own unique ethos and values and ways of working, for better and for worse, frankly. And leaving that after a lifetime of that and coming to a privately owned media organisation and enjoying the change culture where you're able to make decisions very fast. You can try new things. You can fail quickly, like they say in California. You can try things, and if they don't work, stop them, try other new things. I think private media is much better at that, and public media is much slower to respond to kind of market stimuluses for all kinds of different reasons. So I think that's been a really interesting change.
I think it would be fair to say that mainstream media and journalism in particular is in a moment of crisis. And you've talked about how the media has lost its grip on the megaphone. I think that was something you said recently at a conference in Saudi Arabia. What does that mean, and how does that describe sort of the moment that we're in the industry, and why does it matter to everyday people outside of the media industry?
Yeah, it's a really interesting set of ideas, I think. For generations, decades, the media had such a high bar to entry, such a high cost of entry, that the quotes mainstream media effectively were the gatekeepers for almost all editorial content that anybody ever saw. And that gave media great power and great responsibility. they effectively controlled the range of stories that people saw, and they controlled the content that people saw on those stories almost without exception. Obviously, that's transformed hugely in the last 15 years, and the pace of that change in the last 5 or 6 years has been really, really accelerating because of social media. So not only have the media, not only are the media under greater scrutiny than ever as to how they cover a particular story, because people on social media can compare and contrast and can share their views and experiences, but actually, crucially, and what I mean by the megaphone, losing the control of the megaphone, is that the media no longer even have complete control over what stories they cover in the end, because they are subject to huge amounts of influence and pressure via this kind of democratizing force of social media, which is used, responsibly and collectively by millions of people, but it's also sometimes used irresponsibly. And I think what I was particularly thinking about was the way that somebody like Elon Musk has intervened in what stories media choose to cover. So it's not even like how they're covering a specific story, but if you look at someone like Elon Musk's intervention recently, into just to take two examples, the unrest in the north of England last year and the kind of root causes of that, and then his intervention into the German elections on behalf of the Alternative für Deutschland, what known as a far-right party in Germany.
Land reform in South Africa.
Of course,
That.
Another good example. And these are moments where just one man who has the megaphone now, because he is not only the world's richest man, but he also runs what is still, I think, the world's most influential social media site for all its problems. X is still vastly influential on other journalists. And so I think the industry is in this moment of profound transformation where I think we have to dig in on what we do well and explain better how we make the decisions and take the decisions that we do take in the face of a fire hose of criticism, actually, on social media. We can't respond to every piece of criticism, but I think the news media obviously has to do a better job of explaining what its processes are and how it reaches those decisions.
And some of that criticism, presumably, you think is justified.
Oh, of course. And I think I talked about us being gatekeepers, the media being gatekeepers for generations. They were resistant to criticism and reluctant to offer explanations for things. They didn't.
There was no need to explain.
Yeah, they didn't need to. And I think what's changed profoundly is that doesn't work anymore. The media has to explain itself. Just so going back to the example of the civil unrest in the United Kingdom that Elon Musk really took aim at. Those of us who've lived and worked in the UK know that UK media is subject to really strict rules around court cases and court reporting to avoid prejudicing the legal process in the UK. And you can think those rules are good or bad, but they are rules that the media follows. And a lot of the criticism was just based around a lack of understanding about how the media in the UK is constrained about what it can say and report about active legal cases. And that's just like one example of where, as I say, this fire hose of criticism comes in and the media is not able to explain quickly or effectively enough why it is taking the decisions that it is, in this case, to kind of protect the integrity of a judicial process. And I think that's something we all need to reflect on.
And when you talk about civil unrest in the UK, so I think I think you're referring to a grooming scandal that happened in the north, right?
Yeah. So there was a series of riots in towns in the north of England, mainly over the summer last year, and it was triggered by a very tragic murder case where I think 3 young girls were murdered at a dance class. And in the aftermath of that incident, there was a huge amount of misinformation and possibly disinformation around the case circulating on social media. And partly as a result of that, there was social unrest, some riots in some cities in the UK. And I think that why I picked that example was, and then following on from that, as you say, Elon Musk elided that issue with a more historic set of issues around how the government in the UK had or hadn't prosecuted a series of really upsetting and unpleasant sex abuse cases where the offenders were broadly thought to come from one particular ethnic group in the UK. So there were UK, Pakistani gangs responsible for sex abuse. And actually, this was largely a historic issue that dates back 15 and 20 more years.
But he brought it back into the public sphere.
Kind of elided the two issues. As he is perfectly entitled to do so. He's a citizen. He has access to social media. He's able to do that. he asked questions actually that in part people in the UK themselves were asking. But the impact of it was very difficult for the media, the traditional media, to keep up with, in part because, as I say, they function according to a set of rules that they've followed for decades, but are not often able to explain quickly enough. And I think that disconnect between the speed and the lack of mediation on social media and the slowness of legacy media to respond, and often its inability to respond for legal reasons, for example, I think that's just something I'm seeing more and more, and it's causing not just kind of political instability, but it's actually causing, in this case, kind of social unrest.
And you alluded to a lot of people getting their news from influencers or newsfluencers these days, and it's quite interesting when you look at the campaign that Donald Trump ran. It was very different from Kamala Harris in terms of media. He largely rejected the mainstream traditional media, went on a bunch of podcasts, went on to do really well in the election. What does that say about the moment that we're in right now? And it's also interesting when you look at the fact that the White House is now welcoming influencers into the press conferences and giving them accreditation to cover what's happening.
Yeah, and you're right. It's part of the same pattern. It's about loosening the grip of what was the traditional media class on storytelling and the narrative in news. And in some cases, the grip is being prized apart, finger by finger. And in other cases, the media has just relinquished space that other people have moved into. So I think podcasting is a really interesting. We could do a whole podcast here about podcasting, but it's a whole area where audiences respond very well to kind of individual characters on podcasts. That's very, very clear. And if you look at Joe Rogan being probably the best example in the United States, but there are plenty of others where, or maybe Tucker Carlson's show, or like audiences respond really, really well to very strong characters in that podcasting space. And the larger media providers have, I think, struggled weirdly to compete. I mean, of course, they all do have podcasts of their own. But actually, if you look at some of the strongest podcasts, if you like Joe Rogan in the US, or actually some of the rest is ... franchise in the UK, so the rest is politics. These are from smaller providers,
which is a really
more
good
agile,
one.
and they're character-led. And I think they are, and it's another example of where influencers and characters working in that space can move quickly, can build their own audience. I'd call her daddies in the US, another really good example that we've been thinking about how to build a really valuable podcast. Mainstream media really struggle to sometimes generate those ideas, although they can then acquire them. I think you're right politically, just returning to your question, that there's no doubt that Trump's podcast appearances were influential in the election. How influential, I think, is moot. We still don't really know. There was clearly a moment going on about Trump's appeal to sections of the audience, particularly young men, right across ethnic and race groups in the US. Trump appealed very much more heavily to those groups than had been expected, and podcasting was a part of that. I don't think we know yet how much of a part it was, but I think it's really interesting watching the ways in which the Democrats in the US are now asking themselves really hard questions about whether they missed the significance of that moment. That famously, Kamala Harris didn't do some of the podcasts that Trump did. And I think that it just gives you an example about how political campaigning is being changed in real time by the emergence of this kind of decentralized media where main news brands don't exert the universal control that they once did.
And is it the format that doesn't really translate that well in a digital space?
I think it's a lot of things, isn't it? It's partly large news organisations struggle with really strong characters, and I speak from personal experience.
I've seen it myself.
It's like the BBC, likes like all public broadcasters. The BBC says it likes to have strong characters, but often when it actually creates them, struggles to either keep them engaged or contain them. And I think linked to that, large media organisations have a huge amount of kind of editorial compliance, legal compliance. Or if they're public companies, they have similar, like a lot of kind of legal and regulatory exposure. And I think the kind of individual podcaster model kind of busts through all that. They're often much freer, or sometimes much more reckless, bluntly, about saying things that would never pass the compliance phase in a mainstream media organization. And audiences respond well to that because they perceive it as authenticity. Maybe they underperceive the downside risks, we would argue, maybe from the mainstream media point of view. But in the end, the audience votes with its ears. They choose the podcasts that they really, really value.
But how dangerous is that if we're favoring authenticity over facts?
Well,
and that's the environment that we're in.
Exactly, and you've put the question brilliantly. I think that is one of the huge questions facing the media space and the news media in particular. It's like your vibes, your vibe check, or your riz, as my kids would say, counts for as much as what we would be the traditional value of media organizations in terms of kind of truth, accuracy, authenticity, challenging misinformation, giving valuable context and understanding. These are the things that the media cling to as the values that build them. And I think it's absolutely true that the audience is no longer necessarily responding to those to those prompts. And I think it's a huge problem and a huge challenge about how media organizations respond to that.
And how do you think that we got to the moment where we are right now? Because if you go back in time, probably 2-3 years from now, yes, some of the warning signs were there that journalism was struggling, but I don't think people in the industry could have imagined how accelerated this transition would actually be. And I think part of it is Trump as well. But a lot of it comes down to monetization as well. Traditional media is really struggling to make money, and they need to sort of venture out. They need to embrace subscription models. So I don't think that every single brand is going to be able to make that transition. And if you're going to charge people for a service, you better offer something that's very unique.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And there's no use for certainly commercially funded media organizations saying, oh, the audience is wrong, you should take your medicine. I mean, that's just not a viable answer, right? The answer always has to be, we are hearing these messages from the audience, and here is how we are going to respond on a commercial imperative within the framework of providing a value around news services in the case of news media. Absolutely right. I think we're seeing the two things simultaneously, and the digital transformation of the world massively eroded the traditional cost model, the traditional revenue models of media organizations. We could again talk all day about that, how that happened, the decline of print, the rise of lower value digital advertising, the fact that the value of that digital advertising flows mainly to the people who operate the ad exchanges and not the content providers. This is a kind of well-worn ground,
and the quality of the product declines as well, whether it's the BBC or CNN.
For a long time, media organizations responded to that challenge by taking out cost, and understandably, really, really drilling down to take out cost in their operating model, often through removing journalism and content creation posts. We're starting to reach the outer limits of that, I think, and which is where we're seeing really interesting, startups tend to come with a model that is sort of mixed economy between subscription, events, partnered content, some display advertising. But when you look at successful startups, very few of them are actually either wholly or even in part dependent on display advertising, because digital display advertising is just it's lousy revenue. It's difficult to get, particularly in the news space, for again, reasons that are really, really well covered. So, new operators who've come into the market who are being successful, if you look at perhaps things like Axios or Punchbowl in the US, or maybe something like Tortoise in the UK, they come in with a much different set of revenue models, often quite unconventional revenue models, where, for example, somebody like Tortoise make a lot of revenue out of doing essentially kind of corporate communications. They're doing kind of in-house podcast briefing. Axios done the same, of course. They sell their smart brevity concept to businesses. It's a kind of B2B business as much as a B2C business. So you see successful operators taking that kind of mixed economy model. And I think the legacy operators, who tend to have a very significant cost base from generations ago, are really struggling to kind of pivot quickly enough to those new ways of monetizing what they do.
And I think another good example of a platform that's doing quite well is Puck as well.
I pay for Puck with
You
my
pay
own
for
money.
Puck,
Yes, I
okay.
do. Yeah.
It's. I think it's a great product. I've listened to several of their podcasts, and they've talked quite a bit about the rise of the entrepreneurial journalist, which kind of goes hand in hand with what you're talking about. I think to really build a digital product that people are going to be willing to subscribe to, you need, I don't know, maybe a handful of journalists that are really well known within the industry, that have unique access, that are going to be able to break stories. And if you don't have that, if you're, just covering what's already in the news, it's going to be a tough sell to get people to pay for access.
And I think it's the challenge to the kind of a bit of everything model, which including is what the BBC does. And, the kind of quotes mid-market providers who provide a little on everything, that's really, really coming under pressure. And I think you're absolutely right. If you look at Puck, they employ a really small number of journalists, and they pay them really well, incidentally, because every single person who's there can bring value because they get stories that nobody else does, and therefore people like you and me would pay for it. That kind of activity tends to be pushed into niches, whether it's a kind of business niche, something like Bloomberg, where you kind of like, it's the price of a ticket to entry to that world. You're going to have a Bloomberg terminal and a subscription because you couldn't do your business without it. That's a large niche, but like something like Puck, which is a media niche, and then you've got in industry, specialized industry publications and similar kinds of things, niches there, and the implication of that is for any news provider who wants to do a bit of everything across a very wide vista, that is expensive and it's hard to monetize via direct subscription. So, for example, the BBC is moving towards direct subscription for its services outside of the UK, particularly in North America, which I still think is going to be challenging for them, because in the end, the BBC, people are used to BBC services being free, and they will be resistant to therefore starting to pay for them. But also, it doesn't provide deep and specialised coverages in particular verticals. And I think when you look at people's propensity to pay, it tends to be around paying for things that, it's like just a trade-off in your head. If I'm going to pay $120 a year or whatever it is for Puck, that's not nothing. So I want to know that I'm getting real value for my money, and I'm not sure how many people would pay that for the kind of mass provider, particularly in a world where maybe the New York Times or somebody and the Wall Street Journal got into that space first. They paywalled really early. They have they have stitched up, particularly the Times, I think, have stitched up the first tier of people who are prepared to pay for subscriptions in North America. So if you're coming into that space, somebody like the BBC, you're competing to be the second or third paid subscription that people have. And therefore, you've got to... That puts you in a certain position in the market. You're not going to be the first choice provider in that kind of market. So it's really interesting. I remember 15, 20 years ago when in the industry we were asking ourselves, is paywall even the right solution? And, the paywalled publications like some of the Murdoch papers with the Journal and the Times in the UK, but both Murdoch papers, people were asking themselves, well, is this the right way to go? Will it work? Well, I think it has worked. It's kept those papers viable. And I think some of the papers that are really struggling now are ones that really don't have any kind of hard paywall.
And I want to get back to this this idea of trust in the media. When you talk to your own kids, obviously there's a generational divide, and they know that you work in the media industry and that you've been in the industry for many years. Do they trust the media? Do they trust people such as yourself to tell them the truth and to offer a balanced take on what's really happening?
Well, they
in the
definitely
world?
don't listen to me. So one of my children's at journalism college, and when he asked me what he should do at university, I said, I don't mind what you do, but just don't do a journalism undergraduate degree. So obviously that is now what he's gone on to do. But, joking aside, I think I do see a lack of trust in them and people of that generation. They've been raised on direct sources on social media, watch very, very little linear television in particular. And actually, to look at it on the positive side, that generation have, kind of young, inquiring minds that want to challenge what they're being told. They don't want to make assumptions that what they're being told is true. And if you look at issues around the world, the last time I saw my son, who was at university, I had a fascinating conversation with him and his friends about the war in Gaza. They were very animated by these issues that we're seeing here in the region. I think that young people have always felt passionately about those things and wanted to challenge what they're being told. And in that respect, there's nothing new under the sun. But of course, the ways in which they're able to do that in the digital world are very, very different. They have direct access to all kinds of different viewpoints, some of which have more value or more evidence behind them than others. But yeah, they don't take everything on trust, and nor should they. It's fine to ask questions about how do you, going back to what we were talking about originally, like how do you, the media, decide to follow this set of rules? Are they actually rules, or are they just like the code of cozy, comfy club that none of you want to break because you're old? And I think that's a perfectly reasonable set of questions, and it's questions that we should be asking ourselves.
But how do you respond to this changing media landscape? If you're an executive of, I don't know if BBC is the right example because it's such a huge conglomerate, but perhaps an established platform, you're losing money, you don't have a subscription service yet. Do you just sort of do you accept the fact that perhaps as a company or perhaps as a platform you have to shrink and really deliver on the core, build a community around that?
Yeah, quite possibly. And pick up on that word community. I think like the successful models that we've seen, subscription and other forms of paid models, are all built around like, we're a club of people with similar interests and our interests are X. Yeah. And therefore we would be prepared to pay something to be a member of that club, either because we love the brand. It's like, I identify myself as a Washington Post subscriber. Like I pay my own money for the Post. Like I love the Washington Post. I kind of interested in their coverage and other people who read the same stuff. So therefore, I prepared to pay for it and be part of that community. And if you're an executive looking at that kind of business now, you need to be asking yourself, okay, how can I look at my total audience, and within that audience, what is a viable group of people who have enough in common around certain ideas, values, maybe it's geographies, sets of interests, a political worldview, an interest in a category of stories. How do I carve out a group of people, maybe within that much wider group, who would pay? What would they pay? And then what can I afford to run off the back of that to fulfill that subscription? And that's kind of turning the old model on its head. The old model was like, I'm going to decide what we publish. We're going to publish a bit of everything, whack it out there and see if we can make enough money in return. So it's a really, really different mindset, I think, that you need now to run those businesses successfully.
And you mentioned some of the platforms that you think are getting that right. Do you think it's inevitable that a lot of established brands and platforms are either going to shrink significantly or,
perhaps
even go away, because not everyone is going to survive this transition?
I do.
And how do you compete with influencers?
And just in the UK, like in the UK alone, like in the last couple of years, papers I grew up with in the UK, like the Evening Standard, that I remember buying the Evening Standard for 30p when I was first out of university and working. Like the Standard's gone as a print publication, says basis to all intents and purposes. The same with the Independent, or what is now the Eye. These really big media brands that have essentially disappeared as physical objects. And again, you look at some of the startups, and I was looking at what became the Messenger in the US, like a really huge, well-funded startup that just kind of essentially blew up on the launch pad within 6 months of starting. The same with Quibi. This was during lockdowns, this was 4 or 5 years ago. Again, really, really well capitalized with really respected senior leadership. Or here, with what's happened with Monify in this region, like a really big, ambitious startup that's had to lay off very significant numbers of staff in recent months.
Targeting young people around money and tech.
So people are trying new things and failing, which in itself is not a bad thing. It's how the industry innovates, but also there probably is less revenue left. Well, we know there's less revenue left because people's, monetizing people's interests and activity, a lot of that space has shifted away from news. It's now on streaming video for the Netflixes of this world and others in this region. And it's on social media, it's on TikTok. And, if you look at hours per day of screen time, that is a sort of that's a kind of index of how much monetizable activity is out there. And if a huge chunk of that has been drawn away to a platform that's quite difficult to monetize, like TikTok, that's just a lot of revenue that's suddenly off the table. So there's just less to go around to sustain the cost.
Do you think it's possible that some of these platforms are failing because they're essentially taking sort of a traditional approach to creating a digital product, and instead of growing it organically, maybe starting with a podcast, see if there's interest, see if people take to the presenters and growing it for a couple of months, then maybe you're saving millions and millions of dollars that the executives that are launching these ventures are sort of out of touch with how things work these days.
I think there's something in that. I mean, I think of the three that I mentioned there, with Monify, Quibi, and the Messenger. All three of those notably launched with quite significant cost bases. They launched at scale. And I think what you're saying is that there is a successful model where you just learn and build, you iterate, and you fail quickly and stop doing things that don't work. And you start with a very low cost base and just see if you can scale by just being very agile and good at what you do. And I think, again, that's part of the kind of democratizing approach for the media now, which is that I mentioned this much earlier in the conversation, that the costs of entry into our industry are now virtually zero. That a generation ago it would cost you hundreds of millions of dollars to buy a newspaper or a chain of newspapers or a television station or a chain of television stations or in radio, and those were your ways into the media industry. The kind of entry price of the ticket was hundreds of millions of dollars. That is no longer the case. Someone with a good idea can upend the industry or can create a hit podcast probably in 2 or 3 years with just by being good. And it's not costing them very much at all to do it because the costs are, are relatively low. And I think we have to kind of take a step back and say that's a good thing. It encourages a market that's led by ideas, by quality, and by innovation, and by character, and anyone can get into the industry and succeed. So I think you have to sort of, I don't want to be too kind of doom and gloom about this. There are ways in which it is now easier for people to come up with great ideas and monetize them than it was a generation ago because of this gatekeeping issue, again, which we mentioned earlier in the conversation. And that's probably a good thing.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the most interesting trends that you're seeing in the industry, be it traditional media or influencers, digital, that you think are going to play a big role in the future?
Well, I'd say one thing I'm working on. One thing I'm working on at the moment, and I'm spending some time looking at the regional news industry here, particularly here in the GCC. Mm-hmm. And one of the really interesting things is how engaged news audiences still are in this region. So in Western Europe and in North America, we're seeing a lot of news fatigue, a lot of people just switching out of the sector altogether, or just going to providers who aren't credible, to kind of the alternate reality. I think what's interesting about the GCC and the wider MENA region is in part actually because of the animating issue of the Gaza and Lebanon wars. There is still a huge amount of news consumption and engagement with hard news. And also Arabic audiences, they love the news, right? They love to talk about news. They love to engage in sometimes pretty kind of wild discussion about the news and what they think about what's happening in the world. And that's actually one of the things I really love about working here and love about working in Arabic news market, that even when the stories are difficult, and this war has been one of the most difficult stories to cover, people are still really engaged with it. They're not switching off. They want to be well informed. They're still going to what we would think of as mainstream providers, including on television, to get that information. And I think that's something to be happy about because it shows that the experience of the news market around the world is very differentiated. There's not really a global picture. And if you look just only probably a few 1,000 miles from here, a few hundreds of miles from here in India, where there's an incredibly sort of vibrant and booming news market of a kind, an imperfect market, but it's all kinds of interesting things are happening there. So I think that's what I'm really interested in at the moment, is that the experience of Western Europe and North America is important, and clearly North America is massively important because it's the world's most valuable news market. But it's not a cookie cutter for every region on the planet, And I think, we talked a bit about Monify, but I think like one of the things that Monify were doing about doing, and it was interesting, was that they were trying to target audiences in emerging markets rather than established markets. And I think the first people to really crack that, or the first couple of people to really crack that, will succeed, because it just in kind of population terms, you look at India or look at sub-Saharan Africa,
Nigeria, 200 million people.
Yeah, of course. Or Pakistan or Bangladesh, and of course China. You've got these very, very large population bases in societies that are kind of going quickly through digital transformation. The cost of data is falling. So I think the really interesting thing that happened in India, this is when I was working for the BBC, and we had a lot of presence in that market, is that it was the mobile phone revolution in India that turned everything on its head. It was that, the Ambanis got into the mobile market. They artificially really reduced the cost both of smartphones and data. And suddenly, in an incredibly short space of time, this huge population was able to enter very rapidly into having sort of early generation smartphones or full smartphones and access to data so that they could stream video. And that happened much, much faster in India than it did in other markets. I suspect similar things are happening in Nigeria and West Africa, although I've not been back since COVID. And these are really interesting moments where kind of new winners can emerge, new providers can kind of spring up and take advantage of what is actually a kind of digital product and infrastructure revolution first, before it's a content revolution. The same is true of when domestic broadband, wired broadband in Western Europe and North America became viable and was realistic at low cost for audiences. It was actually a technological transformation that upended the industry, and then everything else kind of followed from that. So I think that's something I'm very interested in.
And AI is obviously starting to play a big role.
I can't believe we got 40 minutes into this podcast without either of us mentioning AI. It's terrible.
Yeah.
I mean, look, it's a huge front of mind issue for everyone in this industry, and I think certainly way I'm struggling to original things to say about it because so much ink has been spilled on it. But I feel like the ability of an AI to transform. We talked a lot about cost basis in this conversation. The ability of AI to remove sort of redundant bits of process from your cost base and free up the money that you want to spend on human creativity to be spent on things that only a human can do. And then you end up with the right number of people, human workers, to do that with a lot of heavy lifting from the AI underneath. That is clearly going to be transformational, certainly in the news industry, because you're starting to see an AI can write the first drafts of stories. A lot of print newspapers, digital publishers are now using AIs to generate the first draft of copy that's then maybe subbed and amended by a human journalist. And that has, for those inventory-led models who want to just publish a lot of content, that is clearly massive. It's massive in the television industry, in the TV news, for kind of your ability to search your own archive, to know what's in your archive, to monetize that, to get that on the screen quickly. And also journalism tools, the ability to evaluate huge amounts of open source information at scale. This is something that I've had experience of in the BBC through the work of BBC, an organisation like BBC Monitoring, and some of the big wires agencies, AP and Reuters, are also starting to do this kind of work, just to sort of analyse everything that's out there in the open space, but using a technology tool to do that, to get insights about how the world fits together, but also just bluntly to generate real stories. That is just going to be an incredibly exciting feature of the next decade. When I said I was, grumbling at my son for taking a journalism undergrad, I did at least say to him, like, whatever you do, make sure you take the AI specialism, because the winners and losers in that generation of journalists will be people who can start their careers using AI constructively and helpfully, and critically can think of new ways of using those technologies in newsrooms and in the wider media industry.
Where is the red line when it comes to AI? What can you get away with?
Well, this is interesting
in journalism. I mean, for copy editing, it's really helpful.
So I talked about this again last week at the Saudi Media Forum. The example I gave was like stock photos. So if you read a newspaper story, chances are half the pictures you see are like posed posed by models. So someone holding their phone looking stressed. It's a stock photograph. So if you use an AI to create an image that shows that, is that actually any worse kind of ethically than using a stock photo? Because the stock photo didn't happen in the real world. Someone posed it and then stuck it in a news library, right? And so how do you regulate, label, and oversee an AI technology that would, just to take that as a trivial example, in the generation of images for news stories or for television images, actually, for animations and other ways of kind of making stories visually interesting? There's clearly no point in saying, well, we're never going to do this. It's every newsroom now has to think about its own sets of rules. Newsrooms have to collaborate together across the industry to come up with sort of guidelines and ways of, ways of kind of measuring and assessing what's out there using those AI tools to distinguish between like what is a deliberate falsehood generated by AI and what is a relevant piece of content. So for example, in the news today, President Trump posted an AI-generated video about Gaza that lots of people in this region found really offensive, right? But it's still a fact that he posted that. The fact that it was created by AI and at one level is ridiculous is not really the point. The point is like that is a fact on the ground, and that and therefore a journalist's job is to kind of engage with that and say why some people found that offensive, why it's significant that he posted it at all. Like journalism has to engage increasingly with the existence of AI created content in the world, and it can't be clutching its pearls the whole time about that. It has to just meet the world where it's got to technologically. And I think that whole area is going to be very, very interesting for the ethics of journalism, as you've alluded to, for people to work on.
And so much of that news cycle gets hijacked by everything that Trump says and whatever he posts on social media. I mean, I sometimes wonder if media is doing its audience a disservice by covering the ins and outs of what Trump says and what's happening in Washington.
Well, we could talk about that all day, and I agree with you. I feel very strongly that we read a lot about US content in our household and watch a lot of US content, and I have a home in the US. I'm married to a US citizen, so it's like something I think about a lot, right? And it is certainly the case that when you take a step back from the Trump news cycle, which I described as a bit like a fire hose, it's like drinking with a fire hose. If you just step back a bit and think, what are the really consequential things that happened this week in the Trump news cycle? You often find, I felt like last week, for example, that actually what happened about when Vice President Vance went to the Munich Security Conference and essentially ripped up the traditional NATO compact. That is not only the most consequential thing that happened that week, it's probably one of the most consequential things that has happened since 1989, right?
And it's getting the coverage that it deserves.
With 9/11 and the financial crash, and like just really a really big moment in sort of the history of the West. And yet it was having to compete in the mix with a huge amount of course, incredibly important content about, I don't know, federal job closures in, federal government and Elon Musk's chainsaw. And I mean, you can go on, you could come up with 20 things that are just having, and I think where we're risking this and not seeing the wood for the trees is it's part of the media's job to tune out some of the incredibly tasty and sexy, newsworthy culture wars stuff. Say, hang on a minute, this is an incredibly important moment for the world, let alone for Europe and North America. And the Trump presidency is going to continue to be like that. There are going to be, moments every month or so which are of vastly more consequence than a lot of the noise. And this ability of the media to tune out some of the noise and really focus on the signal, focus on the things that are actually of global consequence. I think that it's a challenge for news providers, but it's one that I think we have to meet. It's kind of what the audience expect from us.
And one thing that you've talked about quite a bit is this need for traditional platforms to sort of explain their thinking and how they're covering certain issues and the thought process behind it. Obviously, it's been a really tough time in the region. We've had that war in Gaza, and when you look at how traditional media has covered that conflict and the response that it's receiving, it's quite astounding, actually. And if we go back a couple of years in time, maybe even 10 years, you wouldn't be able to see the feedback in real time. So does that take away from the work that these organizations are doing? And can you get away with having a bias towards one side of the story, a perceived bias towards one side of the story?
Well, I think specifically on the regional war, I think, again, part of the work I've been doing the last month or so on this is that audiences in the GCC are actually broadly quite accepting of news with a bias, because they understand that the model in this region is not based on this kind of Western European public service model where we try and say, true or otherwise, we try and say that there is no biases, that it's all impartial. Audiences in this part of the world accept that news providers come from a certain direction, whether it's a national interest or a kind of commercial interest. And interestingly, in my experience, even when I was in the BBC, of Arabic news audiences, it's an incredibly news-savvy region. People here have a high degree of media literacy, and they kind of instinctively understand which provider is coming from which angle. So, of course, if you look at, Al Jazeera's coverage of Gaza is this kind of case in point, that it has been very popular in the region and throughout the region, even though people understand the kind of sentiment and biases and point of view from which it's told. And similarly, people will just then pick and choose from other providers, whether they're going to Sky News Arabia or to Al Arabiya, because they just want to hear or feel a different point of view. And I think that's something very interesting and unique, actually, about the Arabic news market. So I think it's given a kind of resilience in that news market to cover this incredibly challenging and emotional story. I think we should mention this, that it has been a story, immense danger for journalists, physical danger. And again, I mentioned this in
to be able to cover on the ground.
Just like the level of deaths of journalists in Gaza in particular has been unacceptable. That's not about what your position is on the overall war situation in the region. Just as journalists, we should kind of recognise this, that some of these regional wars are becoming so dangerous that it is almost impossible for journalists to go there. Our whole journalism model was based on being there. CNN, go there, right? The model is based on people being on the ground and being eyewitnesses. And that model has come under real pressure in Ukraine, and it's coming under real pressure in Gaza and Lebanon because of the very real risks to journalists of covering that war.
It also sounds like you're saying that news consumers here in the region might even be savvier than your average reader or consumption of the news in the West to be able to dissect, what is real, what is not real, what has a bias.
Yeah,
I think that contradicts how we as outsiders view the region.
I do think that, and I think it's part of how the region is misunderstood by outside observers, and I count myself guilty of that a bit, being when I was an exec based in London, kind of sort of pontificating on this region without really fully understanding it or having lived here. I think that's right. I think it's just something in the kind of Arabic mentality about, as I say, really interested in news, really interested in talking about it, arguing about it. It's just part of the kind of currency of life here. And it is hugely positive, but it generates sophisticated news consumers who can, even if it's at a subconscious level, are just kind of taking decisions based on a really close understanding of how the news market works here. And I don't think it is the same in other parts of the world, for sure.
It's interesting that you talk about how things work here in the region and the fact that there is a lot of ambition when it comes to storytelling. I think part of that is international expansion as well. We have a conglomerate, I guess you could say, IMI here, that looked to expand into the UK and wanted to acquire a couple of publications there, including, of course, the Telegraph. But they received a lot of resistance from the government of the UK, I think would be fair to say. What's your thought process behind sort of foreign ownership of of news outlets in other countries, especially outlets that are consumed globally.
Yeah, I mean, it's a rather sorry tale of where we've ended up. You know, I feel very strongly that the IMI bid to own and operate the Telegraph itself was credible. It could have worked. It should have worked. And what happened in the UK was that a group of people who felt very strongly that it was inappropriate for a foreign government to have a kind of large ownership interest in private media.
Yeah, so that's an Abu Dhabi-owned media company.
Right, exactly. And even though the fund, it's IMI Redbird, so it's a kind of it's not 100% Abu Dhabi
Some
fund.
US ownership in there as well.
They felt, a group of people, including a lot of people on the Telegraph and around the Telegraph and Spectator, felt that it was inappropriate for a foreign government to exert that much influence over a UK publication, and they successfully lobbied the previous government to actually amend the law to effectively prevent IMI from wholly owning the Telegraph. They have now sold the Spectator in the process of selling the Telegraph. Personally, I feel strongly that was a mistake. I feel like the paper would have enormously benefited from the investment, the long-term investment that IMI could have put into it. I'm a Telegraph paid subscriber, right? You remember I said, like, things that I pay my own money for. I've been a Telegraph subscriber for 15 years, so I feel strongly about the paper. But I feel strongly that it would have benefited from IMI ownership. And that the kind of mentality of rejecting things from this part of the world is endemic in the West, and it's rooted in a failure to really understand this region. And again, I count myself amongst that. Like, before I lived here, my views were different and not really informed of experience of the region. And I think you see this everywhere. That, you know, I was musing this morning that the kind of Manchester United experience. Manchester United actually won a game of football last night. They're having a terrible time, having to cut a huge amount of money. And part of the reason for that was that they were offered a viable buyout by a UAE entity to own the entire club, and they rejected that in favour of a different model. It's not actually that dissimilar from what happened at the Telegraph. And I think in both cases there has been a kind of not only an excess of caution actually, but honestly a kind of hysteria in the UK about GCC ownership, whether it's Saudi ownership of Newcastle Football Club or whether it's UAE ownership of a football club or a newspaper. There's just a level of hysteria around that in the UK that I don't think is justified. I don't think it's helpful. And I think it's actually based on kind of ignorance and frankly a pretty outdated set of assumptions about how this region and this country works.
But I mean, surely it must be justified to have certain reservations about a company from the outside that might be operating publications under a different level of freedom of expression coming to the UK.
Sure, I think those
discussions
questions.
Need to be had.
I think these are all good questions, but I also feel that there's a kind of element of hypocrisy here that the ownership of private media organisations should not be a state issue unless in exceptional circumstances, which I personally don't think have been met in this case. And the group of people around the Telegraph were the same people who a decade ago were arguing vociferously that the UK government should have no role in the regulation of the media. They fundamentally opposed a statutory media regulator in the UK, which was mooted after a series of editorial scandals, mainly around phone hacking. Some of people listening might remember.
Especially the Murdoch publications.
And that group, exactly the same group of people who spent years arguing that the state should have no role in the regulation of private media organisations, is now the same people who've turned around and implored the state to intervene to prevent a well-regarded and reputable media company from owning a privately owned newspaper in the UK. That seems wrong to me. And my personal view is, as I said, that IMI would have operated the Telegraph well and would have provided much needed investment in a sector that struggles to have its owners invest in digital product and in journalism.
And with the news industry in experiencing such a moment of crisis, isn't it possible that perhaps the most sustainable players in the future will be ones that are backed by governments?
Yeah,
or public service broadcasters.
I'm not sure that's a good thing. And I was thinking, like there was a moment.
Everyone has a view.
There was a moment where there was a sort of optimism around the kind of Jeff Bezos model, where it's like, well, if a billionaire buys your newspaper and operates it as a kind of a benevolent and absent proprietor, maybe it'll all be okay. But look what happened this week. It's happened in the last 24 hours. Jeff Bezos has told the Washington Post that the comment editor of the Washington Post has resigned because Jeff Bezos has made it clear that the comment section of the Post will only publish on issues around personal freedoms and freed markets, and it will only publish opinion pieces from one point of view on both those issues. He has said that explicitly, and he's entitled to say that. He owns the newspaper, right? He paid for it and he subsidizes it. But I'm just saying there is a real struggle now to see, outside of a public broadcasting model, which itself is coming under huge pressure, not just the BBC, but almost everywhere else in the world, coming under huge funding pressure. Even what some of us had hoped were these kind of benevolent billionaire models of, people would buy these assets and run them as kind of small L liberal, part of the media establishment. What's happening with the Post and with Bezos, I think, is really starting to challenge that. And so, it's not good for the media industry to only have one viable funding model, particularly if the only viable funding model
that's a subsidized
a government
model.
Subsidizes it, or anyone subsidizes it. It clearly needs to be a mixed model in every market on the planet, if we can, where there is viable private ownership based on commercial returns, there is viable ownership based on philanthropy, and there is viable ownership based on public media, state-funded, some level public media. That's kind of what you would like to see, but we feel an awfully long way from that right now.
And we've seen several cases in the US of traditional media platforms that have settled lawsuits brought to them or brought against them by Trump for unfair coverage or whatever you want to call it. It's sort of it's a dangerous moment that we're in, because a couple of years ago a lot of those platforms would have stood behind their coverage, their editorial principles, but we're in this and Bezos feeds into it. It's this age of broligarchy, where a lot of companies, whether tech or media, they need to make sure that they have a good relationship with the administration, because ultimately they're businesses, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, elections matter. I've heard this cliche a lot this week, but it's really, really true and important. And if you look at NATO, if you look at the media in the US, you look at the UK just announced it was slashing its international aid spending and moving all the money into defence. This one single election and the result of that election has transformed so many parts of not just American civil society and government, but also governments and the activity of commercial companies around the world. Because despite all of the kind of, this kind of globalist rejection of America as the most important power in the world. But I don't know, guess what? After the election of the second Trump administration, you're really seeing everywhere in the world people re-queuing their approach to really big and important issues based on that one election result. And I guess that tells you something about President Trump, tells you something about America's place in the world, tells you something about the relative strengths and weaknesses of other parts of the world. Look at Europe having to completely rethink its defense spending kind of almost overnight,
which is probably a healthy thing.
It's not a bad thing, but it's definitely a thing. And in this one election, that it was an election hugely consequential. Probably this Trump's second term election will turn out to have been much more consequential, weirdly, than the first term election, because his ability to get stuff done in the second term seems to be a step change up, actually, from the first Trump term, which I think took him as much as everyone else by surprise. And I think this time round he's had certainly 4, possibly 8 years to think about what he would do in the second term, and the kind of tempo of what's happening is very, very much higher than it was.
And we're only a month and a half
into
this.
Only like, well, I don't know how we're all going to keep it up for another 3 years and 10 months, but good for audiences though. People are interested in it.
Definitely.
This is the thing. But people, whatever you think of the rights and wrongs of this, it immensely consequential set of stories, and people are watching them, they're clicking on them, they have an appetite to know about them. And that's narrowly good for news businesses. It's what we're here to do, and we need to take our responsibility to deliver on that seriously.
And we've talked a lot about the challenges, but what excites you the most about the future?
Well, it's kind of that,
and
really.
Maybe technology.
It's like I feel, we're living this extraordinary moment, aren't we, where there's this huge technological upheaval driven by AI and this kind of next generation of digital product intersects with this enormously consequential moment in world history where it's really extraordinary things that we'd all assumed would remain in place indefinitely are being torn up. The kind of post-war settlement, post-World War II settlement, certainly the post-Cold War settlement, is just being upended every day. And the confluence of those two things is certainly consequential. I'm not going to embarrass myself by predicting where it's going to end. I'm not a futurologist.
Especially as it relates to media.
As a media executive, it is an enormously exciting time of transformation for better and for worse.
And is it inevitable that we're going to see an even stronger rise when it comes to influencers and sort of a pivot away from traditional
I think
media?
so, because I think the genie is not going back in the bottle. Audiences are not going to end up back on owned and operated sites, as we call them. They're not going to. The audiences are going to continue to atomize across social media platforms, and there will always be 2 or 3 big winners. And interestingly, TikTok has been the huge winner for the last sort of 7 to 10 years. That sort of palette of social media apps is not going to change that rapidly. It's going to be sort of under half a dozen of big globally dominant apps where most of the eyeballs and attention is on those apps. It's not on the Al Arabiya website or the BBC iPlayer, or much as media organisations would wish otherwise. And that just has profound implications for everything content people do, whether it's in news or general content, general entertainment. And that the genie is not going back into that bottle, right? It's only going to go in one direction, actually. And so in a way, at least we know that, so we can start to make our plans accordingly.
And finally, what does that mean for someone like you who've had his career sort of in traditional media? You're part of that change now. Does it require sort of a rewiring of
I think so. I think I still spend too much time on kind of legacy media. I just spend too much time reading the Telegraph and the Washington Post and watching CNN, although I enormously enjoy all of those things. I think those of us who were probably lucky enough to have a sort of few years of career left ahead of me, but I think we're all having to really readjust to what we consume and the platforms on which we can consume it in order to have a better understanding of where the audience is. Because otherwise, my experience of consuming content that I might commission is so vastly different to where most of the audiences are that I'll start to take bad decisions. And I think the issue is for the people in leadership positions in the media who tend to be older now really, really have to rethink their understanding of where the bulk of the audience is, particularly in a region where there's such a young demographic. It's unique, well, not unique, but it's an interesting feature of GCC. It's a very young audience, particularly in Arabic. And so you just got to really think yourself into like, I'm a 22-year-old Arabic speaker, Arab expat living in Saudi Arabia. Where am I getting my news? What am I reading? What am I clicking on? And I'm not those things. I'm a British dude, so I need to amend my behaviours accordingly. I think all people working in media need to do that. Constantly be thinking about what's my audience's user experience, and really try and separate it from your own habits and fancies.
Amazing! It's been great having you on.
Yeah, lots of fun.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
Cheers.
Thank you.